All right, time to start our week 2 discussion. If you're here watching live or if you're watching later, I welcome you. I want to thank you for joining in. We have chat available and I'm enabling question and answers. So if you want to submit questions, you can certainly do that. Hold on, it says that feature is disabled. So maybe we can't do questions and answers, but you can certainly join in on the group chat should you like to and want to answer questions. So today we're going to be covering a lot of ground. We're going to start all the way back in the end of Exodus and go to the end of Numbers. So all of Leviticus and all of Numbers. So we got a lot of ground to cover. Let me look real quick here. My apologies if you hear hammering and things in the background. I've got some people here working on my house, repairing some of the outside. So, yeah, we're going to start in Exodus chapter 35 if you'd like to follow along in your Bibles. That's where we'll begin. So let me get there real quick. Exodus 35, and we'll pick up where we left off last week. So we have this giving of the law. Moses has come down from the mountain, and now he's in the process of giving the law to the people of Israel. And what we see here in Exodus 35 is just really a lot more of that. It continues on into chapter 36. What I found fascinating when reading through this, you have a group of people that were essentially slaves. Certainly they would have been skilled craftsmen in some degree because they were the ones that were building the pyramids. That's the word I'm looking for. So they were the ones building the pyramids, and some of them may have had some skill in those trades. The work that they're being asked to do here is high skill work, and they're not exactly in a place where they have all of their stuff. So they might have some of the tools available, but they certainly didn't have the workshops and all the other stuff that would go with civilization. They're sitting at the bottom of a mountain. It's a bunch of people that have just migrated, so they don't have all of their tools handy, which is interesting given what they're able to do, because the craftsmanship, the craftsmen were selected by God himself, which is important to note. But the amount of detail and things that are required in the work with the different types of wood, or the acacia wood, and then gold overlay, that would take quite a bit of skill and could be quite dangerous. So it's interesting to see how they put it all to see the depth of description that's given here. These are very descriptive passages, and when you read through them, you can't help but notice the detail that was paid to these items that are being crafted and how important they are. And really, this happens all the way through, chapter 38 of Exodus. And in chapter 38 of Exodus, I found this part interesting. In verse 24, all the gold that was used for the work in all the constructions of the sanctuary, the gold from the offering was 29 talents and 730 shekels by the shekel of the sanctuary. The silver from those of the congregation who were recorded was 100 talents and 1,775 shekels by the shekel of the sanctuary. A beka, a head, that is half of a shekel, by the shekel of the sanctuary for everyone who was listed in the records from 20 years old upward for 603,550 men. So everybody contributed to this project, and it's just really neat, when you see a big project come together. That's really kind of what is going on here, and you can in some ways appreciate that kind of on behalf of the nation of Israel. In chapter 39, we see the making of the priestly garments. In chapter 39, verse 2, he made the ephod of gold, blue and purple and scarlet yarns and fine twined linen, and they hammered out gold leaf, and he cut it into threads to work into blue and purple and the scarlet yarns, into fine twined linen in skilled design. They made for the ephod attaching shoulder pieces joined to it at its two edges, and the skillfully woven band on it was of one piece with it, and made like it of gold, blue and purple and scarlet yarns, and fine twined linen, and the Lord had commanded Moses. So what we see here is the construction of these garments that are just very intricately detailed, and in ways of craftsmanship that probably would have been uncommon at the time, but not impossible or unheard of. But using gold as a fabric and weaving it into the pattern there is something that was very required a lot of time and effort, and they spent a lot of time working on these things. In verse 30, I mentioned last week about the golden crown. Verse 30 goes over that again. They made the plate of the holy crown of pure gold and wrote on it an inscription like the engraving of a signet, "Holy to the Lord." And they tied to it a cord of blue to fasten it to the turban above, as the Lord had commanded Moses. So this was the crown for the high priest to wear. Interesting that the high priest is wearing the crown in this case rather than the king. The king, of course, being God for the Israelites. So in their case, the high priest would have not served as a king, but served as the king's representative. And it's important to note that he even had a crown associated with that position. So in chapter 40, they go and they set up the tabernacle. I really didn't get anything until verse 34. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle throughout all their journeys. Whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. It's interesting here when you think about the presence of God for the Israelites. They got to see a manifestation in some ways of God amongst them every single day. And really was their guiding light, so to speak. So it was interesting to see this, this constant presence of the Lord with them. But as you read through, especially Numbers, you really start to appreciate how little they appreciate what they have. Not that they're any worse than us. We have tremendous blessings wherever we are at, just to be children of His. But so often we're willing to throw those blessings aside for a little bit of pleasure or a little bit of something that we feel we deserve. And Israel was no different in that way. And sometimes for things that were much less basic than what we look for, as we'll see when we get into Numbers specifically. So then we move into Leviticus. You have a bunch of law giving. Very good to read through the law giving. It gives you an interesting perspective on what they had to do. In Leviticus chapter 4, verse 13, I highlighted that passage. If the whole congregation of Israel sins unintentionally, and the thing is hidden from the eyes of the assembly, and they do any one of the things that the Lord's commandments ought not to be done, and they realize their guilt, when the sin which they have committed becomes known, the assembly shall offer a bull from the herd for a sin offering, and bring it in the front of the tent of meeting. I found it interesting. I guess I really wasn't aware. I know I've read this before, but just must not have paid much attention to sinning unintentionally. So, there's plenty of times where we don't mean to do the wrong thing, but we do end up doing the wrong thing. And what should be done in that case? And in this case, Israel had to offer restitution for that. We'll find out later that they would have to offer restitution plus 20%, actually, 1/5. So whenever you do wrong, it's important to make things right and to even really go one step further. And that's something that God taught the Israelites here in Leviticus chapter 4. Starting in chapter 5, if anyone sins in that he hears a public adjuration to testify, and though he is a witness, whether he has seen or come to know the matter, yet does not speak, he shall bear his iniquity. Or if anyone touches an unclean thing, whether a carcass of an unclean wild animal, or a carcass of an unclean livestock, or a carcass of an unclean swarming things, and it is hidden from him, and he has become unclean, and he realizes his guilt, or if he touches human uncleanness, or of whatever sort the uncleanness may be with which one becomes unclean, and it is hidden from him when he comes to know it and realizes his guilt, or if anyone utters with his lips a rash oath to do evil or to do good, any sort of rash oath that people swear, and it is hidden from him when he comes to know it and he realizes his guilt in any of these things. When he realizes his guilt in any of these and confesses the sin he has committed, he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation for the sin that he has committed a female from the flock, a lamb or a goat for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him for his sins. So when we think about, for me, this is a great passage, it kind of foreshadows what Christ does for us, because these are sins that you didn't even realize that you've done, but in this case you have the lamb or the goat that is the sin offering, and our sin offering is the Lamb of God. So it's really just a great foreshadowing of what is to come, and for us, the forgiveness that we have for those things that we don't even know that we've done wrong sometimes. Perhaps we said something to someone and we hurt them in ways that we had no intention of doing, and they never say anything to us. Maybe they forgive us and move on. It's still a sin that we need to be forgiven of. So it's important that when we think about our life and the sin that it is in our life, that we think about the sins that we don't even realize that we've committed, and that we make sure that we ask God for forgiveness of those and ask him to help us make atonement for those things that we've done wrong. Moving on, in chapter 6, we still have more on offerings and that kind of thing. In verse 27 of chapter 6 of Leviticus, whatever touches its flesh shall be holy, and when any of its blood is splashed on a garment, you shall wash that on which it was splashed in a holy place. And the earthenware vessel in which it is boiled shall be broken. But if it is boiled in a bronze vessel, that shall be scoured and rinsed in water. Every male among the priests may eat of it. It is most holy. It's interesting that the sanitation that they go through, realizing today we know how dangerous blood can be, and transmission of disease. And at that time, they even, were medically ahead of their time. In chapter 7, verse 19, flesh that touches any unclean thing shall not be eaten. It shall be burned up with fire. All who are clean may eat flesh, but the person who eats of the flesh of the sacrifice of the Lord, peace offerings, while an uncleanness is on him, that person shall be cut off from his people. And if anyone touches an unclean thing, whether human uncleanness or an unclean beast or any unclean detestable creature, and then eats some flesh from the sacrifice of the Lord's peace offering, that person shall be cut off from his people. It really, that would, being cut off from your people, that's an idea that our society doesn't embrace well. We have prisons that cut you off from your people, but so many people don't really grasp what being cut off from your people really does to you, and how important it is to avoid. So for Israel, even with what they were eating, they had to be careful so that they would not have to be cut off from their own people. So chapter 8, we start to look at Aaron and his sons. In verse 5, starting in verse 5 of chapter 8, and Moses said to the congregation, "This is the thing that the Lord has commanded to be done." And Moses brought Aaron and his sons and washed them with water. And he put the coat on him and tied the sash around his waist and clothed him with the robe and put the ephod on him and tied the skillfully woven band of the ephod around him, binding it to him with the band. And he placed the breastpiece on him. And in the breastpiece he put the Urim and the Thummim. And he set the turban on his head, and on the turban in front he set the golden plate, the holy crown, as the Lord commanded Moses. So we see Aaron being really clothed the first time in his holy garments, and his sons along with him. They end up giving an offering, and it was acceptable to God. But in chapter 9, verse 22, then Aaron lifted up his hands toward the people and blessed them. And he came down from the offering the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting. And when they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. And fire came out before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the pieces of the fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. We get back to the glory really really of God and the presence of Him in His people here. I mean, the offerings here are just consumed by a fire that, and the fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering. I mean, it's not like it was just already lit and, like we do. We have a pilot light and then we turn the gas on and magically the stove lights up. It's nothing like that. This was, a fire that consumed everything that was there, and all the people saw it, and there really couldn't be any confusion with that many eyewitnesses. I mean, we're talking about, hundreds of thousands of eyewitnesses, probably over 1 million people at this point that would have seen that. So next we have the story that most people like to tell, which is from this chapter 10 of Leviticus, and that's the death of Nadab and Abihu. And there's so much focus placed on that. I mean, it is a good story, obviously, in that it's true. And it gives us a good example of what it means to serve God, that we need to do it on His terms, not on ours. But what I think is interesting and what is often overlooked is the story of Aaron's other two sons, not Nadab and Abihu, but Eleazar and Ithamar. They are left to take over Nadab and Abihu, undoubtedly knowing what had happened to their brothers, I should say. And it's interesting to look at what's going on with those brothers. In verse 16 of chapter 10, now Moses diligently inquired about the goat of the sin offering, and behold, it was burned up. And he was angry with Eleazar and Ithamar, the surviving sons of Aaron, saying, why have you not eaten the sin offering in the place of the sanctuary, since it is a thing most holy and has been given to you, that you may bear the iniquity of the congregation, to make atonement for them before the Lord? Behold, its blood was not brought into the inner part of the sanctuary. You certainly ought to have eaten it in the sanctuary, as I commanded. And Aaron said to Moses, behold, today they have offered their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord, and yet such things as these have happened to me. If I had eaten the sin offering today, would the Lord have approved? And when Moses heard that, he approved. So we see forgiveness here. We can't say specifically why Nadab and Abihu were not forgiven, except that they offered strange fire, and God said, that was not okay, and their lives were taken. But Eleazar and Ithamar also offered up worship that was not acceptable in the way that it was offered, nor did it follow the direction which it was supposed to be done. And yet forgiveness is granted to them. It appears as though they had a repentant heart of what they had done wrong. So it's important to note that, we often characterize the God of the Old Testament as an angry, jealous God. And, he certainly is jealous and sometimes angry with just cause. But here we can also see His forgiveness. And we'll continue today in today's reading, see a lot of forgiveness of God where Moses and Aaron plead with Him, and He doesn't punish Israel as He believes they deserve to be punished. Moving on to chapter 12, purification after childbirth. Verse 6, and when the days of her purifying are completed, that is the mother that gave birth, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb a year old for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. And he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her. Then she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, either male or female. I found this passage interesting because the idea of original sin should be addressed here. Moses has been given the law directly from God, and yet the sin offering is for the mother. And it says very, very specifically that, and he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her. So, if we were looking for original sin in the Bible, this would be a great spot for that original sin to be atoned for, yet Israel makes no atonement for it under God's law. So it's an interesting concept that some people hold, this idea that when a baby comes into the world, that it's born with sin, because the sin offering here is not made on behalf of the child, but it is made on behalf of the mother that bears the child. So next we get into the laws about leprosy. If you don't know what leprosy is, you can Google it. It's not a pleasant disease. We don't suffer from it much anymore because of antibiotics, but in their time, they wouldn't have had antibiotics. So quarantine was the most effective way to control it. And we learn about quarantining and the laws of cleaning house and those sort of things to make sure that these diseases don't spread amongst the community. In chapter 15, verse 31, thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. The idea here that this tabernacle of God is a holy place, and if there's anybody with any impurity, they really need to stay away. A lot of times we look at God as our friend, and it's not to say that he is not, but some friends you hold in higher reverence than others. And he needs to be that friend that we hold in high reverence, that we have that respect for, where, we all know the person. You go over to their house, you make sure that you take your shoes off at the front because everything is perfect in their house and you don't want to get any mud. And, so, you show them that honor and that respect for what they want. And that's really, God deserves that and so much more. So chapter 16, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they drew near before the Lord and died. And the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron your brother not to come at any... Oops. My Bible program crashed. Hold on one sec. I'll get it back up here. There it goes. Tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat that is on the ark, so that he may not die. For I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. But in this way Aaron shall come into the holy place with a bull from the herd for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. The reason I highlighted that passage is I thought it might give us some insight. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron about why the sons might have been, why their offering was strange. It's called strange fire. But evidently they might have been out of place too in terms of where they were at, because this is the direction, he's relating this direction as a consequence of what had happened there. So just a possible insight on maybe it wasn't just strange fire, because whenever other people violated the will of God with regard to sacrifice, forgiveness was granted. Chapter 16, verse 30, for on this day shall atonement be made for you to cleanse you. You shall be clean before the Lord from all your sins. It is a Sabbath of solemn rest to you, and you shall afflict yourselves. It is a statute forever. So when we think about Jews and their unwillingness to give up the law, especially as we see in the New Testament, it's interesting, this passage. In their law is that forever they will keep these statutes. So we know that in the early church that there was dissension between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians, and what should be expected of those Gentile Christians. And so we know that there were the two sects of the Christians at that time, but this would certainly give us some indication as to why, because they have a specific covenant with God, and it says it is a statute forever. So they certainly would, excuse me, be in error according to Leviticus in practicing their things, as long as they realize that Jesus is the fulfillment of their law. Moving on to chapter 18 of Leviticus, in verse 22, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. And you shall not lie with any animal, and so make yourself unclean with it. Neither shall any woman give herself to an animal to lie with it. It is perversion. There's a lot of people that, because of the recent Supreme Court ruling, are very distraught about the United States and where it's going. God's law is the same. It doesn't change because the Supreme Court said, hey, this is how we're going to let people act. Our government can certainly make laws on marriage, but the ultimate laws regarding marriage and how men and women and men and women are to interact are defined very clearly for those who would serve Christ. It's not our job to legislate our religious beliefs. It's our job to influence others to want to be followers of Christ like we are followers of Christ. And when we think about this law from the Old Testament, We have certainly a precedent here for why we shouldn't be engaging in those activities. But at the same time, we need to remember cases like Corinthians where they had engaged in these activities previously and yet had turned and were Christians. So, it's not, these activities are not things that that take you so far from God that you can't come back. And sometimes we are the reason that people don't come back because of how we push people away because of their sin. Instead, we should be welcoming them when they return. In chapter 19, verse 17, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your son, the son of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. It's interesting when you're looking at chapter 19, the law that's given first here is the love your neighbor as yourself law. And then in verse 19, the very first, 5 words there, you shall keep my statutes and shall not let your cattle breed. And then he goes into the different statutes. There's a lot of them there. In chapter 20, we get into different punishments for different types of things. And really, the theme of chapter 20 can be found, I believe, in verse 22. You shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my rules and do them, that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out. That's a very powerful way to say that. He's bringing them to a land that will be theirs. And as long as they do what he has asked, he will keep it theirs. And that's really kind of one of the first places we start to see that that covenant that he's making with Israel. Skipping ahead through Leviticus, we have a whole bunch of stuff about the feasts, the lamps, the bread, punishment for blasphemy, the Sabbath year. And then we get to the year of Jubilee. That was an interesting portion for me. Not that I wasn't aware of it, but I found verse 18 specifically interesting of chapter 25. Therefore, you shall do my statutes and keep my rules and perform them, and then you will dwell in the land securely. So we have that idea again. As long as Israel is following the commandments of the Lord, they will be secure. And they're promised that multiple times by Moses here. In chapter 25, starting in verse 54, I found this to be another interesting section about redeeming a poor man. And if he is not redeemed by these means, the means that came before it in the verses, if you've read them, he and his children with him shall be released in the year of Jubilee. For it is to me that the people of Israel are servants. They are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. This is talking about slavery, basically, and how the sons of Israel cannot be slaves of anyone except God. And even if they are, every 7 years, they aren't anymore. They're released. So when we think about who are we a slave to, or what are we a slave to, we might be a slave to alcohol, we might be a slave to pornography, we might be a slave to greed or money or any number of different terrible things. We have to, at some point, give that up and have our year of Jubilee if we want to be with Christ. And that's something that we can, see some foreshadowing of here with the slavery relationship amongst the Israelite nation. In chapter 26 of Leviticus, starting in verse 3, if you walk in my statutes and observe my commandments and do them, then I will give you your rains in their seasons, and the land shall yield its increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. Your threshing shall last to the time of the grape harvest, and the grape harvest shall last to the time for sowing. And you shall eat your bread to the full and dwell in your land securely. I will give peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and none shall make you afraid. And I will remove harmful beasts from the land, and the sword shall not go through your land. You shall chase your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall chase 10,000, and your enemy shall fall before you by the sword. I will turn to you and make you fruitful and multiply you, and will confirm my covenant with you. You shall eat old store long kept, and you shall clear out the old to make way for the new. We have here a much longer version of what we've already talked about with the covenant that God has made with Israel. So they've definitely been given the promise multiple times of if they behave, everything's going to be great. But if they don't, maybe not so much. So then we move on to the book of Numbers. In chapter 1 of Numbers, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month, in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Take a census of all the congregation of the people of Israel by clans, by fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male head by head. From 20 years old and upward, all in Israel who are able to go to war, you and Aaron shall list them company by company. So we have the command there of what Numbers is, at least in part going to be about. And then it goes into listing the different tribes and the numbers of men. And the total listed are 603,550. So what we really need to, we can kind of roughly extrapolate from there the census of Israel. Men at age 20 and older, if there's 603,000 of them, they probably had wives. So we could probably double that number. And then among their wives, they probably had multiple children. In our culture, we typically have 2 to 3 kids. If we took that out, that would, we've already doubled the number to 1.2 million. Now we're at 2.4 million. The reality is they were probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 million people at the point of this census. If we were to just kind of figure, just based upon societal norms for that time, they had a great number of children. We know Aaron had 4 children compared to what most of us would have. We'd normally cap out around 3. So they definitely had more children than we did. And so their numbers were probably significantly higher. Goes through the arrangements of the camps and how they're to be arranged, the sons of Aaron, the duties of the Levite priesthood. My Bible program is going to crash again here, so hold on while it misbehaves. Yeah, there it goes. No, maybe not quite yet. Let me just close it and reopen it. Pardon the technical difficulties here. They are far better this week than they were last week, I'll tell you that. Actually, a video, you can see my ugly mug this week. Let's see here. So the duties of the Levites in Numbers chapter 3, redemption of the firstborn. It's interesting. I didn't highlight any passages here, but when you read these passages about the redemption of the firstborn, the point where God made the firstborn his, in verse 40 of chapter 3, and the Lord said to Moses, list all the firstborn males of the people of Israel from a month old and upward, taking the number of their names, and you shall take the Levites for me. I am the Lord, instead of all the firstborn among the people of Israel, and the cattle of the Levites instead of all the firstborn among the cattle of the people of Israel. So Moses listed all the firstborn among the people of Israel, and the Lord commanded him, as the Lord commanded him, rather. And all the firstborn males, according to their number of names, from a month old and upward, were listed at 22,273. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the Levites instead of all the firstborn among the people of Israel, and the cattle of the Levites instead of their cattle. The Levites shall be mine. I am the Lord. And as the redemption price for the 273 of the firstborn of the people of Israel, over and above the number of the males of the Levites, you shall take 5 shekels per head. You shall take them according to the shekel of the sanctuary, the shekel of the 20 gerahs, and give the money to Aaron and his sons as the redemption price for those who are over. So Moses took the redemption money from those who were over and above those redeemed by the Levites. From the firstborn of the people of Israel, he took the money, 1,365 shekels by the shekel of the sanctuary, and Moses gave the redemption money to Aaron and his sons according to the word of the Lord, and the Lord, as the Lord had commanded Moses. So we see there this idea of redeeming the firstborn, and we'll see in a little bit later about how special God holds the firstborn child in the nation of Israel. Next, we have unclean people. There's a test for adultery. Don't think that test works today, but if you want to try it out, feel free to. Just don't follow through on any of the conclusions, because it's probably illegal to kill your wife where you're at. Confession and restitution. We've got the Nazirite vow. Aaron's blessing, offering of the tabernacle consecration. Cleansing of the Levites. And then in chapter 9, the Passover is celebrated. So it's interesting because we have the giving of the law. The Passover is supposed to be celebrated annually. And in chapter 9, verse 1, and the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness in Sinai in the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Let the people of Israel keep the Passover at its appointed time. On the 14th day of this month at twilight you shall keep it at its appointed time, according to all its statutes and its rules, you shall keep it. So Moses told the people of Israel that they should keep the Passover. And they kept the Passover in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that the Lord commanded Moses. So the people of Israel did. Even they'd been at the same spot for a year now. That's how long they've been hanging out here. I mean, so if the Egyptians had wanted to mount some massive campaign to come back after them, they certainly were just sitting out in the desert and could have done that. But God was protecting them. So here we have, it gives us a time frame for the amount of time that they'd been out there in the wilderness. You have the cloud covering the tabernacle. And then in verse 11 of chapter 10, in the second year, in the second month, on the 20th day of the month, the cloud lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony. And the people of Israel set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai. And the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. They set out for the first time at the command of the Lord by Moses. So here we see them moving for the very first time since they had started their camp out at Mount Sinai, at the base of Mount Sinai. Doesn't take them long to start complaining, as we see in chapter 11. And Moses really gets kind of fed up with it because it's not anything that's new. So elders are appointed in verse 18 of chapter 11. And say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat, for you have wept in the hearing of your Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was better for us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall not eat just 1 day, or 2 days, or 5 days, or 10 days, or 20 days, but a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why did we come out of Egypt? Hold on 1 sec. Someone's at my door. It's busy right now, okay? Why can't we have my snack? Yes, you may. Hurry up. All right, so to continue here, sorry about that interruption. People are complaining they don't have meat. They've got plenty of food, just not the type of food they want. So God sends them quail, as you can see in verse 31. It's more quail than they could possibly know what to do with. And it ends up causing a plague amongst them. So next you have Miriam and Aaron oppose Moses. That's a pretty common Bible class story. And then in chapter 13, we have the spies sent into Canaan. Numbers is really just chock full of Bible class stories. So it's a great book for that. In chapter 13, verse 1, you really get the theme there. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. For from each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a chief among them. So they chose the men and sent them into the land of Canaan to spy it out. And in verse 25, they come back and they say, at the end of the 40, it says in verse 25, at the end of the 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. So they have this bounty that they had collected where, I mean, just the grapes alone took 2 guys to carry all the bushels of grapes that they'd gotten. And the people still, don't believe that they can take the land. It's just, for whatever reason, they're not convinced, even though they've seen the power of God multiple times, saw them crush the mightiest army on the planet. They probably wouldn't have had any perspective on how mighty the army was. It was just incredibly impressive to them. But as we know, it was the mightiest army in existence at the time. Yet they still did not have the faith to trust in God. In chapter 14, in verse 20, God promises judgment. Then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word, but this is after Moses had interceded on behalf of the people. But truly as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers, and none of those who despise me shall see it, but my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land into which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. It's interesting that he notes Caleb's different spirit. When people describe us, or when someone describes me, I hope that they would describe me as having a different spirit in a good way, obviously. I know plenty of people would say I'm different, but to have a different spirit that's good would be great. And that's what Caleb had. Next, you've got more laws. There's a Sabbath breaker that's executed in verse 32 of chapter 15. Once again, just kind of reiterating how important it is to follow the laws of God. And then in chapter 16, you have the rebellion of Korah, starting in verse 1. Now, Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Korath, son of Levi, and Dathan and Abiram, and the son of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men. And they rose up before Moses with the number of people of Israel, 250 chiefs of the congregation, chosen from the assembly, well-known men. They assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron, and said to them, You have gone too far, for all in the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? It's interesting that they did not recognize that with Moses literally being described as the meekest man on earth, that they still made the assumption that these men had elevated themselves, whereas God is the one that had elevated them to the positions of power that they were in. And Korah and his followers were just completely unable to see that, and that resulted in bad things happening for them. So in verse 31, and as soon as he had finished speaking all these words, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households and all the people who belonged to Korah and all their goods. So they and all that belonged to them went down alive into Sheol, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. And all Israel who were around them fled at their cry, for they said, Lest the earth swallow us up. And the fire came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men offering the incense. So the results aren't good for them. It's not pretty, that's for sure. But it's important that when we think about men that are in power, whether we like them or not, that we give them the reverence that God commands us to. And this is really what happened that's really what happened here. Korah did not give Moses and Aaron the reverence that they deserved from God. And if we do that same thing, if we don't give them people the reverence that they deserve, we'll end up sinning as a result of it. Chapter 17, you have the story about Aaron's staff budding. 18, you got duties of the priests and the Levites. 19, laws for purification. There's just a lot of laws in these two books. Next week, or today, I guess, you'll start reading Deuteronomy. We've already made it through, after we're done with Deuteronomy, we've made it through all the way through the Jewish Bible, the Torah, the books of law. So we're chugging right along, and I'm excited about our progress. Chapter 20, the waters of Meribah. This is where Miriam died. Now, there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, Would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. They're not so much high on Egypt anymore, although they do mention it. They want them to be brought back to Egypt, but they think that the people that died as a result of their sin were better off than they were. Moses responds here by striking the rock rather than doing what God had commanded him to, and that would be part of Moses' downfall later on. Next, you have the death of Aaron. Edom refused to let Israel pass through their territory. You've got Arad destroyed, and then you have the bronze serpent. And once again, you have God mad with the people because of how they'd acted. They acted childishly, and God was upset with them. So in verse, we have the story of the bronze serpent, and he sent serpents into the camp. In verse, let's see here, 7. Yeah, verse 7. So Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on a pole, and if a serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. So definitely a miracle. Bronze serpents don't just today cure snake bite. So we have a miracle of God being worked among the people there. Next, you have kings defeated. So whenever Israel was wandering around in the desert, they weren't just walking around aimlessly. They were actually conquering territory, even though they didn't really hold it as such for like they would the promised land. You have the story of Balaam's donkey and the angel. That's another popular Bible class story. You have the 4 oracles of Balaam. And then you have the Baal worship at Peor. The Bible program collapsed again, so we're going to pull that back up. There it is. So now we have a new generation, and Israel is tasked with, Moses is tasked, along with Eleazar, with counting all these people again. So we count all the people again in chapter 26, chapter 27. We have the successor to Moses found. In verse 12, the Lord said to Moses, "Go up into the mountain of Abarim and see the land that I have given to the people of Israel." Abarim, excuse me. "When you have seen it, you also shall be gathered to your people as your brother Aaron was, because you rebelled against my word in the wilderness of Zin when the congregation quarreled, failing to uphold me as holy at the waters before their eyes. These are the waters of Meribah of Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin." So this is where the Joshua ends up taking over in the place of Moses, and Moses is seen kind of fading away here. So chapter 28, we have the offerings, and all the different kinds of offerings. Same thing for 29. In 30, we have laws about vows, men's vows and women's vows. We have vengeance on Midian in 31. Reuben and Gad settle in Gilead. So we see the first real settling of people of the tribes of Israel in 32. And then in chapter 33, we have just kind of a retelling of Israel's journey. And in verse 50 of 33, and the Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you pass over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you and destroy all their figured stones and destroy all their metal images and demolish all their high places, and you shall take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have given the land to you to possess it. You shall inherit the land by lot according to your clans. To a large tribe you shall give a large inheritance, and to a small tribe you shall give a small inheritance. Wherever the lot falls for anyone, that shall be his. According to the tribes of your fathers you shall inherit. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those of them whom you let remain shall trouble you in the land where you dwell. And I will do to you as I thought to do to them." So we see here the command of God to the Israelites on what they're supposed to be doing when they get in the land. If you're a Bible student, you know that they don't exactly follow these principles and end up getting in trouble because of it. So there's a list for tribal chiefs, cities for the Levites, cities of refuge are defined here. Marriage of female heirs, so in cases where there is not a male heir, what is to happen. So that really wraps up the book of Numbers. It's a very interesting read, to say the least, about the transition of Israel as a wandering nation state as they start to become a real force to be reckoned with in that Middle East territory, that Jordan Valley there, as they're heading that way as we move into Deuteronomy. So for next week's reading, we're going to be looking at, let's see here, Deuteronomy chapter 1, and we'll finish up at Judges 21. So we're going to hit Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges, and we'll discuss those next week. I hope you have a great week of reading God's Word. I know it's been a great impact on me so far, only 2 weeks in. We've got 7 weeks to go. 7 weeks, that's not right. We've got 10 weeks to go. So I'm excited about it. Keep up the good work. If you have friends that want to join in, please invite them. Just have them pick up where we pick up. If they want to go back later and cover the ground that we've already covered, they can certainly go back and see the older YouTube video. in this YouTube video. But anybody who wants to start right now, we certainly encourage that. We're starting today, day 15 in Deuteronomy chapter 1. If you want to do today's reading, it's Deuteronomy 1 through Deuteronomy chapter 10. So we love having you, and been very glad to talk about God's Word with you this evening. I hope it's been encouraging for you as it has been for me. I hope you have a good night, and God bless.